we had dealt with most of the head and like the neuroanatomy. Now coming to the drainage system, that is the ventricular system of our brain. Okay, that is what we will be learning today. Okay, the ventricular system. So we know what is ventricular system. It is the cavities. Ventricle in the sense it is a bag or it is a cavity. Okay, these ventricles communicate with each other. Okay, the whole of the ventricular system of the brain, it communicates with each other. Okay, and what is it for? What is it, the requirement of these ventricles? It is for the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, for the production, transport and removal of cerebrospinal fluid. The CSF will be produced, transported and also removed from the brain via this, not only brain, from the central nervous system via this ventricular cavity. So, how many ventricles are there? There are two lateral ventricles, a third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. And along with that, we have a intercommunicating system, that is our interventricular foramen, cerebral aqueduct. Then we also have other foramens and also the central canal. Okay. Now, a short thing about cerebrospinal fluid. What is the CSF? What is exactly the CSF? CSF is the ultrafiltrate. Okay, it is ultrafiltrate of what? Of the plasma. Filtrate of our plasma. Okay, that is what the CSF is. And what is it required for? It acts as a shock absorber or a cushion. Okay, it acts as a cushion for the brain and also all of not only for the brain, all the nervous system. Okay, mostly the CNS, that is the spinal cord, and the brain, mainly the brain. It limits the neuronal damage. For example, if the person has a whiplash or if the patient has a concussion, the CSF reduces the damage to the brain itself. And also the actual weight of the brain is what is the actual weight of the brain? The CSF reduces the weight of the brain to 25 gram. Okay, the CSF acts as a buoyant thing. Okay, it helps in reducing whichever thing which is immersed in the water or any fluid. It reduces it the weight, the corresponding weight of the organ or any object. Okay, any object for the matter, it will be reduced. Okay, similarly the brain, because it is there in the it is surrounded with the CSF, its weight also it's reduced. The actual weight of the brain is what? It's around 1.3 or 1.5 kilogram. But when it is there, when the CSF is surrounding the brain, the weight drastically reduces to 25 gram. Okay, 25 grams. So thereby this brain has to be floating in CSF. You can imagine as if the brain is floating in CSF, so that it will not compress on the base of the brain, because all the structures, all the important nerves and all the important vasculature of the brain is present in the base of the brain, right? So if the base of the brain is compressed because of the weight of the brain, all the blood supply will be cut off, the nerves will be damaged. So to prevent that, the buoyancy has to be maintained. So the weight of the brain will be reduced to around 25 gram. Okay, from 1.3 or 1.4 kilogram, it will be reduced to 25 gram. That is one of the other functionality of the CSF. The next function of this CSF is to maintain the equilibrium. Okay, maintain the equilibrium, that is a chemical equilibrium. Chemical stability will be kept. Okay, because the CSF is full of glucose, then other electrolytes. Okay, other electrolytes. And remember, this synaptic transmission. Okay, synaptic transmission requires something. It requires lesser amount of potassium. Potassium amount should be lesser. So the CSF is the environment. Okay, it is the environment which allows this proper synaptic transmission by creating a low potassium atmosphere. Okay, that is one of the function. Now coming to the main topics, the ventricles. Okay, ventricles produces CSF. Okay, ventricles, not ventricles as such. There is something called as ependymal cells. Okay, there is something called as ependymal cells. Okay, ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are responsible for the production. Okay, there is something called as choroid plexus. This choroid plexus has this ependymal cells. Okay, choroid plexus has this ependymal cells which is responsible for the production of CSF. Okay, so these ventricles are lined by these ependymal cells which produce the CSF, and CSF will circulate within the ventricular cavity, within the cerebral aqueduct, within the central canal. Okay, that is how the thing occurs. Okay, now the circulation, remember there are four ventricles, two lateral ventricles, right and left lateral ventricles, one third ventricle and one fourth ventricle. So totally four ventricles are there. Now moving on to each ventricle. First on the lateral ventricle, remember it is a C-shaped structure. Okay, it is a C-shaped structure. So it's a C-shaped structure, and this one is the largest cavity. Okay, lateral ventricles are the largest cavity, and remember that when we divide these ventricles into parts, the lateral ventricles into parts, we have an anterior part, a body and a posterior part, and also one inferior part. Okay, so body is not exactly considered a different organ, different portion. We have an anterior horn, posterior horn and an inferior horn. Three horns are there. Okay, three horns are there. Okay, mainly we have a body with the anterior horn which is going anteriorly, a posterior horn which is dipping posteriorly into the posterior lobe, and the inferior lobe along with the which is going into the temporal portion of the brain. Okay, and this lateral ventricle has to communicate with the third ventricle, right? The two lateral ventricles has to communicate with with the third ventricle. Okay, right? And for that it needs the foramen. Okay, it needs a foramen, right? It needs a foramen which is called as interventricular foramen or foramen of Monro. Okay, foramen of Monro. Now remember, whatever CSF which has formed in the lateral ventricles, it has to enter into the third ventricle, which is here. Okay, this one, this figure is called as third ventricle. So the CSF which has been produced in the lateral ventricles enters the third ventricle via this foramen of Monro, otherwise called as interventricular foramen. Okay, remember the size, remember the shape of the lateral ventricle, remember the portions, okay, or the horns, frontal, occipital and temporal. Okay, and the foramen of Monro. Now coming to the foramen of Monro, that connects this lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. Okay, now one more thing you need to remember is the boundaries. Okay, whichever fossa or whichever triangle or whichever thing you remember, you need to study in anatomy, you also need to know about the boundaries. So what are the boundaries of lateral ventricle? Remember the first one, the roof of the lateral ventricle is our corpus callosum. Remember, it is a corpus callosum. This portion is the lateral ventricles. Above that we have a corpus callosum which is connecting the left to right hemisphere, right? And then the floor or lateral wall is by the caudate nucleus or the thalamus. Okay, caudate nucleus or the thalamus, and the medial wall is by the septum pellucidum. Okay, septum pellucidum is a medial wall. Okay, that was about lateral ventricles. Yeah, remember I mentioned about foramen of Monro. Foramen of Monro connects this lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. Okay, it connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricles. Now, only one third ventricle is there. Fine. Now, third ventricle is present between the thalamus. Okay, we have two thalamus, right and left. So, between this right and left thalamus, we have the third ventricle. Okay, we have the third ventricle. Okay, we have the third ventricle. Remember that? Between the two thalamus. That is what you need to remember. Okay. Nothing extra to remember about this one. Just remember it has two protrusions. You have supraoptic recess and infundibular recess. Not that important as such. Just remember these names. Okay, supraoptic recess. The term recess, when you hear, you should remember something about the third ventricle. Okay, the lateral ventricles connect to the third ventricle via the foramen of Monro, and the third ventricles are situated in between the two thalamus. Okay, in between the two thalamus. That is the thing you need to remember. Now coming to the fourth ventricle, remember how this foramen of Monro, this one foramen of Monro connected the it connected the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. Similarly, the third ventricle now connects to the fourth ventricle. Okay, fourth ventricle is present in the brainstem. Okay, now this is connected via one aqueduct that is called as sylvian aqueduct or cerebral aqueduct. Sylvian aqueduct or cerebral aqueduct. Okay, now this is the last. This fourth ventricle is the last ventricle in the system in brain. Okay, in the brain it is the last system. Okay, it is connected via the cerebral aqueduct to the third ventricle. It lies within what? Within the brain stem. Okay, where in the brain stem? Between the pons and medulla. Okay, this is the pons and this is the this is the medulla and this is the pons. So in between these two we have a ventricle. Okay, remember this is situated between the pons and medulla within the brainstem. Okay, it is connected to the third ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and inferiorly it connects or it drains into what? It drains into the central canal. Central canal of what? Central canal of the spinal cord. Central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, it connects to the central canal of the spinal cord. Fine. You can, if you see over here, this is the figure. Remember, there is the lateral ventricle connecting to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen. Third ventricle is connecting to the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct, and finally it drains into the central canal. And one more thing you would remember is about two more foramens. Okay, two more foramens, which is actually foramen of Lashka and foramen of Magendie. Okay, foramen of Lashka and foramen of Magendie. Okay, this connects the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space. Okay, it connects the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space. Fine, because remember the CSF that is now there in the fourth ventricle drains into the central canal, but it also has to drain into the subarachnoid space of the brain, right? Subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and the pyometer. So similarly it also has to drain over there. So for that it needs to drain via some space or foramen. That foramen is called as foramen of Lashka and Magendie. Okay, foramen of Lashka and Magendie. Fine. And after it reaches the subarachnoid space, it then is reabsorbed into the circulation, that is via the venous plexus and everything. Okay, so that was about the ventricles. Yeah, one more thing I forgot to mention about the boundaries. Okay, remember the boundaries of fourth ventricle, that is also important. The floor, remember, it is between the pons and medulla, right? It is situated between the pons and medulla, and remember it is present posteriorly to the pons and medulla. Fine. So that is why the floor anterior boundary of the fourth ventricle is the pons and medulla. Okay, pons and medulla. Similarly, the roof, what is there behind the pons and medulla? We have our cerebrum. So what connects the cerebellum. What connects the brainstem to the cerebellum? The cerebellar peduncle, right? Superior cerebellar peduncle in posteriorly. Okay, we have a superior and inferior cerebellar peduncle, and other than that we have a medullary velum, inferior and superior. Okay, these are the boundaries of fourth ventricle. Remember, anteriorly, or the floor. Okay, remember anterior is floor Anteriorly, we have medulla and pons, and posteriorly, we have the cerebellar peduncles, superior and inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so any problem or any blockage in these, anywhere in this CSF drainage or anywhere in the ventricles will lead to something called as hydrocephalus. That is a clinical portion of this one. Fine. So yeah, that was regarding this ventricles. Okay, the floor I have already mentioned about these things. And any injury, okay, any injury to any of these portions, any injury or any hydrocephalus condition. Hydrocephalus means there is increased collection of CSF. So increased collection of CSF will exert more pressure, right? Exert more pressure in the surrounding organs of these ventricles, right? What is there in the surrounding organs? We have the pons and medulla. What is there in the pons and medulla? We have our cranial nerve nucleus. So any problem in this fourth ventricle, mainly in the fourth ventricle, that will adversely affect the hypoglossal nerve. It will affect our vagal nerve. It will affect our other vestibular nerve and many other nerves which are present in the mainly the lower cranial nerves. Okay, the hypoglossal, vagus, even glossopharyngeal can be affected. Okay, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12th. These cranial nerves are usually 8 is minimal, but 9, 10, 11, 12, the last 4 cranial nerves are majorly affected in any problem or any issue associated with the fourth ventricle. Okay, remember one more thing I forgot to mention is the shape of the fourth ventricle floor. It is a rhomboid fossa. Okay, it is a rhomboid shaped. It is in the rhomboid shape. Okay, so yeah, that was regarding the ventricles. Now remember about corpus callosum, which we mentioned, right? What is corpus callosum? Corpus callosum is basically the white matter. Okay, when we speak about white matter, what is this white matter? White matter is nothing but the axons. Okay, gray matter means the cell bodies and white matter means the axons. So anything that connects two things to any fibers that connect the central nervous system, okay, the parts of central nervous system to each other, that we will consider as fibers. Okay, which is called as commissural fibers. Okay, commissural fibers is otherwise called as our corpus callosum. Okay, white matter is otherwise termed as fibers in the CNS. So we have association fibers, we have projection fibers and commissural fibers. Remember, corpus callosum is a commissural fibers. Commissural fibers means what? It connects the left and right side. Okay, it crosses the midline. It crosses the midline. If it crosses the midline, it is called as commissure. And the major commissure in the CNS, in the brain, is the corpus callosum because it connects the left to the right. Okay. Right and left hemispheres are connected to each other via this commissural fibers, and the biggest one is called as corpus callosum. There are others also, but yeah, corpus callosum is the main one. Other ones are association fibers and projection fibers. Remember, the association fibers do not cross the midline. Okay, it does not cross the midline. And what does it do? It connects the cortical regions within the brain. Okay, within one hemisphere only, it connects the different parts. Like you see in this figure, the green colored lines are the ones which connects the cortex with each other, right? It connects the cortex with each other. So similarly, we have projection fibers. Projection fibers are the fibers that connect the higher to lower centers. Okay, we have higher centers, like the cortex is a higher center. Comparatively, thalamus is a lower center. There are fibers which connects the thalamus to the higher center, or the higher center to the thalamus. So that is considered to be a projection fiber. Okay, it connects the higher to the lower center, lower to the higher centers in the CNS. Okay, all these things are within the CNS. So remember, we have 3 kinds of fibers: association fibers, projection fibers and commissural fibers. Association fibers, again we have major types of association fibers. These are the names. Just it might be a little difficult to remember. No worries, you don't have to mug up everything. Just remember what is association fibers. If you remember the corpus callosum, that is enough. Corpus callosum is what kind of fiber? It is a commissural fiber, right? It is a commissural fiber. If you remember that, that is enough. All the other things are either association fibers or the projection fibers. Projection fibers are usually not named. It is named by the portions it is connecting. Okay, by the portions it is connecting. That is how the projection fibers are named. Association fibers are also named. If questions are given, select the commissural fiber. Corpus callosum is the main one. Okay, it is the major commissural fiber. Remember that. Okay, that much if you remember, it is enough. Okay, now corpus callosum, again, it has different portions. Okay, it has different portions. So first one, it connects the occipital cortex. Okay, we have to connect the occipital cortex also of right and left side. That portion is called as forceps major. Okay, that is called as forceps major. Remember this. Corpus callosum is not only this portion. It is the, if you take a sagittal section, you will see the entire thing is called as corpus callosum. Okay, if we have the anterior portion, if we take the anterior portion, it is the comparatively smaller. Thickness is lesser, right? The thickness of the anterior portion is lesser. You see it over here, right? Comparatively to the occipital portion or the posterior portion. So it is called as forceps minor. Okay, anterior portion is called as forceps minor. Similarly, posterior portion which connects the occipital lobe is called as forceps major. Okay, and then coming to tapetum. Tapetum is one which is what connects the temporal lobes to each other. Okay, it connects the temporal lobe to each other. That is the major thing about the corpus callosum. That is the fibers. Okay, I'm not talking about the macroanatomy. It is a microanatomy. I'm talking about the fibers, types of fibers, not the actual parts of corpus callosum macroscopically. Macroscopically, we have a genu, we have a splenium, etc. Okay, we have bulb, we have posterior horn, etc. We have that will be dealing with later on. Okay. So association fibers is, remember, there are other kinds of fibers which connect the parts of cortex of the same set, that is called as association fibers. Next, moving on to the nerves. Okay, till now we were talking about the major parts of the brain and everything. Now we have to move on to the other nervous system. Okay, we spoke about the brain, we spoke about the other parts of the brain and everything. Now we have to speak about the peripheral nervous system, majorly the autonomic nervous system. Okay, autonomic nervous system is majorly divided into parasympathetic and sympathetic. That we all know. Okay, parasympathetic and sympathetic, how it is opposite to one another, all the things we know. I will be dealing with in detail about this nervous system now. Fine. Yeah, sympathetic nervous system, we know it is majorly for fight, flight and fright stage. Okay, the major adrenaline rush what we speak about, that is by the sympathetic nervous system. Similarly, what I spoke about right now, right? Adrenaline rush. So remember, fright, flight and fright is for adrenaline rush, and similarly the neurotransmitter is via the noradrenaline or epinephrine. Okay, norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter which is useful in this one. And where is it required? It is required in stressful situation. And remember, what is the location of this sympathetic nervous system? Where is this sympathetic fibers present? It is present in the spinal cord. Okay, sympathetic nervous system is majorly from the spinal cord. Okay, it is only in the spinal cord, majorly in the thorax and the lumbar region. Thoracolumbar outflow. If you listen carefully, it is a thoracolumbar outflow. Thoracolumbar outflow, if you hear anywhere, it is about the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so thoracolumbar outflow. Similarly, parasympathetic is entirely opposite to that of sympathetic nervous system, that is rest and digest. Okay, relaxation, relaxing hormone, or no, sorry, not hormone, rest and digest or relaxing is via this parasympathetic nervous system, and this one is via the craniospinal or craniosacral outflow. Okay, remember, craniosacral outflow. So just by the term you can understand it is via the brainstem, mainly the um, lower cranial nerves, that is our 7th, 9th and 10th. Okay, 7th, 9th and 10th cranial nerve, and also a third. Okay, and also via the spinal cord, that is the sacral, right, the S2, S3, S4. Okay, the sacral segments and the cranial nerve segments are responsible for the parasympathetic activity. Okay, otherwise called as craniosacral outflow. Craniosacral is for parasympathetic, thoracolumbar is for sympathetic. Just remember that. Okay, and neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. What is neurotransmitter in sympathetic nervous system? It is the norepinephrine. Okay, this is the basic difference that you have to know, must know things. No, good to know things is the sympathetic nervous system. What are these functions? Okay, what does this thoracolumbar outflow do? Okay, what does it do? So, in the fight flight response, what happens to our pupils? It has to dilate. What happens to our mouth? It becomes dry, so the salivation has to be decreased or inhibited. Okay, we need more air. Okay, more air has to be going into our lungs so that we can breathe properly. We will be hyperventilating, right? So more amount of air is required. That is why to the bronchus it will cause vasoconstriction. Sorry, not vasoconstriction, bronchodilation. Similarly, it will accelerate the heartbeat. Okay, we need more blood supply to the parts of the body. We need to run away from the situation, so the heartbeat has to increase, the heart rate has to increase, so the heartbeat will be accelerated. Okay, we will have goosebumps, right? Goosebumps is also via this thoracolumbar outflow, that is a piloerection. Similarly, we do not need this digestion part of, we do not need to relax and digest our food at that time, so we have to inhibit our peristalsis. All the secretions will be reduced. Okay, similarly we need more amount of glucose so that we can run properly, our muscles can work properly. Similarly, so that the glucose production will be increased. We need more adrenaline and noradrenaline to fight the mechanism, so we need more amount of adrenaline and noradrenaline. So from the adrenal glands it will be secreted in more amount. Okay, we have contraction of bladder which will be inhibited. Okay, we do not have time to pee, so the bladder contraction will also be inhibited. Okay, and also other thing is it will simulate orgasm. Okay, so these things are responsible via this thoracolumbar outflow, via the noradrenergic response, via the sympathetic nervous system to fight, flight or fright. Now coming to the parasympathetic nervous system. Sorry for that. Next one is parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is via what? It is via the craniosacral outflow. Craniosacral outflow is via the cranial nerves and also via the sacral segments S2, S3 and S4. And what does it do? It is helpful in resting and digesting. So we do not need the dilatation of pupils. Right? Why does this pupil dilate in sympathetic nervous system? We need to fight, right? We need to see maximum what is happening around us, so the pupils dilates in the sympathetic nervous system. But when the parasympathetic nervous system is active, the pupils will constrict, entirely opposite to that of the entirely opposite to that of sympathetic, and this constriction of pupil happens via the oculomotor nerve. Okay, that is why oculomotor nerve plays an action in the craniosacral outflow. Even though I spoke about the lower cranial nerves, upper cranial nerve, that is our oculomotor nerve, also has an action on the parasympathetic system. Fine, and then we need to digest, right? Saliva will be stimulated. We need to digest our carbohydrates, so saliva has to be stimulated. The bronchoconstriction occurs, that is opposite to that of sympathetic nervous system. The heartbeat is slower, relaxing, right? The heartbeat has to be reduced, the heart rate has to be reduced. Digestion, right? Digestion will require more amount of peristalsis and more amount of gastric secretion. That is why the gastric secretion will also be increased. And next, in the hepatobiliary, to digest fat and everything, we need bile. So bile release will be increased. Okay, all this is via the vagus nerve and also via the facial nerve and everything. Why facial nerve comes into play? To act on the saliva. Okay, similarly glossopharyngeal is also acting on the saliva. All the other parasympathetic outflow is via the vagus. Okay, all the other is via the vagus. The bronchial constriction, the slowing of heart rate, the peristaltic movement, the secretion of gastric juice, and also the secretion of bile, everything is controlled via the vagus nerve. Also, it has an action on the kidneys. And mainly, the sacral outflow is activated via the pelvic splanchnic nerve, S3, S4, S2, S3, S4. That has an action on the bladder. It contracts the bladder. Okay, it has an action on the bladder via contraction. Okay, next thing, remember how I spoke about the goosebumps? What is goosebumps? The technical terminology for goosebumps is piloerection. How does it act? How does it occur? It acts via sympathetic innervation of the erector pili. Okay, erector pili muscle, which is innervated via the sympathetic outflow, that causes the pilomotor fibers to activate this erector pili muscle, which causes the hair to stand erect. Okay, that is why the piloerection or goosebumps happen. Now, this sympathetic outflow has also an action on the vasomotor system. Okay, on the blood vessels. What does it do? It causes vasoconstriction. Similarly, pseudomotor nerves, the sweat glands. Okay, sweat glands also is under the control of sympathetic nervous system, where this one, sweat glands, okay, will undergo activation, and thereby instead of this norepinephrine release, there will be release of acetylcholine. Okay, acetylcholine will be secreted. How we have norepinephrine release in the sympathetic nervous system, but one exception is in the case of pseudomotor fibers, which innervates the sweat glands, where instead of norepinephrine, acetylcholine will be released. Okay, that is one extra thing that you will remember. Okay, so postganglionic release, and which neurotransmitter is released? The acetylcholine is released. Okay, now other things you need to remember. Everything else is because there's all the other nerves gradually or somewhere it does go into a synapse. But in case of adrenal glands, okay, in case of adrenal glands, there is no synapsing. Okay, it does not synapse, and this sympathetic fibers directly goes into the medullary cells without synapsing. Okay, synapse doesn't take place in case of adrenal glands. Okay, and that is why adrenal medulla is considered to be a part of sympathetic nervous system, because this sympathetic outflow tract, the thoracolumbar outflow, that directly goes and goes into the medulla, into the adrenal medulla, and secretes this norepinephrine and epinephrine, that is adrenal and noradrenaline, into the bloodstream. Okay, that is how the endocrine activity of adrenal medulla takes place. Fine. And because it is into the bloodstream, all the organs, like all the entire body, will be activated into giving a sympathetic response. Okay, that is how the sympathetic system acts in the body via the adrenal medulla. Fine. Now coming to the parasympathetic outflow, I have already mentioned about the oculomotor nerve, facial nerve, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerve, right? Now oculomotor nerve, I have mentioned about the constriction of pupils, and this occurs due to through the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Okay, it occurs through the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Similarly, facial nerve, it acts on what? It acts on increasing the salivary secretion. How does it act? It acts via the superior salivatory nucleus. Similarly, the salivary glands are also stimulated via what? Via the glossopharyngeal nerve. Through what? Through inferior salivatory nucleus. And similarly, all the other major organs, that is the heart, the bronchus, the GIT, everything, the hepatobiliary, everything is also under the control of which one nerve? Which is via the vagus nerve. through dorsal vagal nucleus. Okay, you need to remember the origins also. Okay, from where does this parasympathetic outflow, okay, outflow is originated into the cranial nerve, where it is getting integrated or originated into the cranial nerves. Okay, so these names you remember: Edinger Westphal in case of oculomotor, superior salivatory and inferior salivatory in case of facial and glossopharyngeal, and also dorsal vagal nucleus in case of vagus nerve. Fine. Now coming to the lateral horns of spinal cord, that is the sacral outflow is via the splanchnic nerves via the S3, S4 and S2. Okay, S2, S3 and S4 is via the pelvic splanchnic nerve. Okay, so that was about this one. Same thing, I've mentioned everything over here. I've already mentioned every major details. Fine. Next, moving on to the nerve plexus. Now moving on to the somatic nerve. Once we finish the somatic nerves, we will move on to the not somatic nerves, somatic nerves. We will move on to what? We will move on to the cranial nerves. Okay, first somatic, then cranial. First and foremost, we have to know about the spinal cord. Okay, we have to know about the spinal cord. Here I have given a small segment of spinal cord, but remember, what is spinal cord? It is a nervous tissue, right? It is a nervous tissue. Not only nervous tissue, also consists of supporting cells, right? And it extends from where? It extends from the brainstem to the lumbar vertebrae. That much you know. And it is actually an extension of medulla, right? It is an extension of the medulla or continuation of medulla into the vertebral canal, right? And what does it contain? It contains the spinal cord, and around that it will have what? It will have the meninges. And what does this meninges have? Meninges also has the subarachnoid space which contains the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, let me see if I have, this figure, if you see one cross section or mid sagittal section I've given over here. So this, in this figure, you might see that at the level of up to here, right, up to this level, you can see the spinal cord is properly continuing without any problem, and it ends over here. Okay, it ends in this section. That portion, or that is corresponding, it corresponds to L2. Okay, it corresponds to L2. Okay, so the spinal cord terminates at L2. Okay, it terminates at L2 level. Okay, after that it tapers. Okay, after that it tapers off into something called as conus medullaris. Okay, it tapers off into conus medullaris, and afterwards, okay, afterwards, whatever spinal nerves which arise from the spinal cord, it bundles up together. Okay, bundles up together, and you can see all the spinal nerves that is coming together. It is in the form of a bundle, right? The nerves are in a bundle. So that bundle is called as cauda equina. Okay, cauda equina, because it looks like a horse tail. Okay, that is why it is called as cauda equina. Okay, now the major thing you need to remember about this spinal cord is that there are portions. Okay, there are portions where this spinal cord enlarges. Okay, we have a cervical enlargement. Okay, cervical enlargement and also a lumbar enlargement. Okay, the spinal cord is not a straight rod. Okay, at the cervical area there's an enlargement. Okay, like this, somewhat like this. Then around in the thoracolumbar area, again we have an enlargement. Okay, this cervical enlargement, from this something happens. What happens? Brachial plexus originates. Okay, brachial plexus comes out from the cervical enlargement, and from the thoracolumbar enlargement we have lumbar plexus and our sacral plexus, which arises from this lumbosacral enlargement. Okay. So that was about the gross feature about of the spinal cord. Now, when we speak about the spinal cord as such, okay, the cross section of spinal cord, we need to know two more things. Okay, we need to know the structure and what is present in this spinal cord and how is the spinal nerve formed. Okay, how is the spinal nerves are formed. Remember, the spinal nerves are actually what? It is actually the yeah, sorry, yeah, spinal nerves are actually mixed nerves. Okay, it is a mixed nerve. Spinal nerves are called spinal nerves because it originates from the spinal cord itself. That is why it is called as spinal nerves, and this is a part of which system? Somatic nerves, otherwise called as the peripheral nervous system. Okay, peripheral nervous system. So each spinal nerve, no, each spinal nerve has two roots. Okay, it has a dorsal root, it has a ventral root. Okay, it has a dorsal root and a ventral root. Okay, so each spinal nerve has two roots, one dorsal root and a ventral root, and these join together to form a spinal nerve. Then after the spinal nerve is formed, then it divides into dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Ramus are nothing but the divisions. Okay, it divisions, anterior division, posterior division, how we speak about. So the anterior division and posterior division. Fine. We have a posterior or dorsal root or ventral or anterior root, and that joins together to form one nerve, and this nerve divides again into anterior division and posterior division. Now, in the dorsal root, we have something called as dorsal root ganglion. Okay, dorsal root ganglion. Okay, which is basically a synapse. Okay, or a or a unipolar unipolar neuron which synapses together with the, no, that is not that important, but yeah, remember it has a dorsal and ventral root. In the dorsal root we have a ganglion called dorsal root ganglion. Afterwards, when it joins together, we have a spinal nerve. Spinal nerve again gives out branches or divisions, first divisions, that is anterior and posterior division, and that division again gives off branches. That is why we have cutaneous branch, we have a muscular branch, we have sympathetic ganglion branches. Then similarly, both the sides, okay, there is only one side, both the sides the same thing occurs. Okay, the spinal nerve originates in the spinal cord, it enters the intervertebral foramen, and as soon as it enters or leaves the intervertebral foramen, it becomes a spinal nerve, and finally it divides into two, posterior rami and in anterior rami. Posterior rami is usually for the deep muscles of back, the back muscles, right? Back muscles and the skin of the back. Okay, the posterior rami are usually shorter. Remember, see, it is shorter because it supplies a vertebral column in the or the deep muscles of the back. Also, the cutaneous branch or cutaneous branches to the skin over the back. But the anteriorly is larger, and it supplies all the if required sensory portion via the cutaneous branch. It also gives off muscular branches to the anterior portion of the body. Okay, all the things happen in the anterior division or ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. Okay, now how many nerves are there? How many spinal nerves are there? We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and also one coccygeal nerve. Okay, these many spinal nerves are present. Okay, that is what you need to remember, the number of cervical nerves. Cervical nerves 8, thoracic nerves 12, lumbar nerves 5, sacral nerves 5, and finally coccygeal 1. Okay, yeah, this is how the dorsal root ganglion occurs. Okay, dorsal root ganglion looks like this. You have a unipolar nerve which transmits the sensory information. Okay, sensory fibers go via this um, dorsal root ganglion. Okay, that is one thing you need to remember. And the efferent signals. Okay, efferent signals means, efferent means it goes, the signal goes via the efferent nerve fibers. Okay, you can remember like ego. E always goes from one portion to the other. Okay, efferent means something is going, ego. Okay, something is going. So efferent signals are basically motor fibers. Okay, it's basically motor fibers or responses. So efferent signals is via the anterior horn, and the dorsal horn is via for the sensory information. That is one more thing you need to remember. Okay. Next, remember about the plexuses. Okay, what are the plexuses? We have a cervical plexus, I have mentioned. We have a brachial plexus, we have a lumbar plexus, we have a sacral plexus, and we also have a coccygeal plexus. Coccygeal plexus and cervical plexus not that much important, but you should know. Okay, this table, if you remember, that might be enough. But yeah, this is a basic thing that you have to know. Fine. Cervical plexus, what are the root values of cervical plexus? We have C1 to C4, C1, C2, C3 and C4, and a portion, upper portion of C5 also takes part in the formation of cervical plexus. We will see it later on when we speak about cervical plexus as such. And where does this cervical plexus supply? It supplies majorly to the head, neck and shoulders. Head, neck and shoulders is via the cervical plexus. Okay, where is it present? It is present in this posterior triangle of neck. These triangles and spaces we will be dealing with later, but yeah, it is present in the posterior triangle of neck. Now coming to the brachial plexus. Where is this brachial plexus present? You might have seen the dissection. It is present in the axilla. And what are the root values? You have to be thorough with this because it is very much important. The root value of brachial plexus is C5 to T1. Okay, C5 to T1 is the root value of brachial plexus. Okay, what does it do? It supplies a motor and sensory supply to the shoulders and upper limb. Brachium means upper arm, right? Brachium means arm. So upper limb sensory and motor supply is via the brachial plexus. It also supplies the shoulder. That you have to know. Then lumbar plexus. Lumbar plexus, we have T12 to L5. Okay, T12 to L5. There might be a slight difference from what you have studied that we will be dealing with later on. Okay, you will understand when we deal with each and every plexus in detail. Okay, and where does this lumbar plexus supply? It supplies the back, it supplies the abdomen, it supplies the groin, thigh, calf and knees. Okay, and where is it present? It is present within the psoas major muscles. Okay, just behind the psoas major muscle. Finally, the sacral plexus, that is from L4 to S3. Okay, L4, L5, S1, S2, S3 is the root value of sacral plexus, and that supplies the pelvis, the buttocks, genitals, the thighs, calves, and feet. Okay, and where is it located? It is located in the posterior wall of pelvic cavity. Okay, remember, lumbar plexus supplies up to calf, and the feet are supplied by sacral plexus. You know sacral nerve, right? Peroneal nerve, sacral nerve, tibial nerve, everything is via the sacral plexus. So, the feet is supplied via the sacral nerve. Coccygeal nerve, it only supplies a small part of the coccyx. Not that much relevant, but yeah, you just need to know. There's something called as coccygeal plexus. That's what you need to know. And coccygeal plexus is formed by the S4, S5 and coccygeal 1 root. Okay. Now, whichever plexus you study, you need to remember about the root. Okay, what portions of the spinal nerves are taking part in the formation of this plexus? For example, in case of cervical plexus, which is there, we have C1 to C5. Okay, C1 to C5, C1 to C5 ventral root. Okay, C1 to C5 ventral roots are taking part in the formation of cervical plexus. Where does it supply? It supplies the head, neck and also shoulder and little portion of chest. Through what? Through nerves. Okay, you need to know the roots, you need to know the branches, and you need to know the nerves which is arising from each and every plexus. Okay, we have cervical plexus. From this cervical plexus we have two kinds of branches. One is superficial branch, otherwise called as cutaneous branch, and then we have deep branch, otherwise called as motor branch. Usually the superficial branches supply the skin and the deep branch supply the muscles. That is why deep branch is otherwise called as motor branch and superficial branch is otherwise called as cutaneous branch. Now I have already mentioned cervical plexus supplies what? It supplies the head, neck and shoulder and chest. So what are the portions of the head and neck? We have a occipital portion, right? Occipital, lesser occipital nerve, which is from the C2 and C3. Okay, that supplies the posterior aspect of neck. Lesser occipital, right? Posterolateral aspect of neck. Greater auricular, again C2 and C3. That supplies the skin over what? Skin over the ear and parotid gland. We have a transverse cervical. It supplies what? It supplies a neck, which portion? Anterior portion and lateral portion. Then finally we have a supraclavicular nerve that supplies the shoulder and clavicular region. Superficial branch is not much important, but when we speak about cervical plexus, there is one nerve that you have to know. That is about the ansa cervicalis. Okay, ansa cervicalis, that is what you have to remember about cervical plexus, because that supplies the infrahyoid muscle. Okay, we have omohyoid, sternohyoid and sternothyroid muscles. Okay, they are the infrahyoid muscles of neck. Okay, so that is supplied by the ansa cervicalis. About ansa cervicalis, you need to remember what is it. It is a motor branch. It is a deep branch of the cervical plexus with the root value C1 to C3. Okay, ansa cervicalis C1, C2, C3, deep branch or motor branch. Fine. Then coming to other branch, other important one is the phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve is also a branch of, it is a nerve that originates from the cervical plexus, and the root value is C3, C4, C5. And what does it do? It is a major or the only motor supply of which muscle? The diaphragm. Phrenic nerve is for diaphragm, originates in the cervical plexus. What is the root value? C3, C4, C5. Okay, phrenic nerve and ansa cervicalis are the must know things in cervical plexus. If you remember nothing else, you have to remember this. Okay. Next most important plexus that you have to learn or you will learn is about our brachial plexus. Okay, yeah, so brachial plexus can be divided into roots, trunks, divisions, cords and terminal nerves. Okay, I'm not going to detail about everything. I will just mention about the nerves, the branches of roots, branches of trunk, branches of divisions, branches of cords and terminal nerves, and the root values are important, so that is also something you need to remember. Okay, so we know from C5 to T1 we have our brachial plexus, right? C5 to T1. So the roots of C5, ventral roots. Okay, the anterior roots of these nerves or spinal nerves join together. Anterior roots of these spinal nerves join together to form this brachial plexus, C5 to T1. So C5 and C6 joins together to form upper trunk, right? And C7 continues to form the middle trunk. Okay, just bear with me. We'll continue into the brachial plexus together. Then finally we have C8 and T1 which joins together to form the lower trunk. Okay, brachial plexus has 5 roots, 3 trunks. Okay, and these each trunk divides into anterior and posterior division. Okay, each trunk divides into anterior and posterior division. Okay, and then anterior division of the middle and upper trunk join together to form the lateral cord. Okay, there is a lateral cord. Okay, anterior division of the upper trunk and the middle trunk join together to form the lateral trunk. Okay, and the lower trunk anterior division of the lower trunk continues to form the medial cord. Okay, we have three cords, three trunks, right? Three trunks and three cords. Anterior division of the middle and upper trunk join together to form the lateral cord. Anterior division of the lower cord continues itself to form the medial cord. Okay, and all the posterior division join together to form the posterior cord. Okay, now we need to remember about the nerves associated with each portion. So roots, brachial plexus is important because the roots also gives out branches like dorsal scapular nerve C5. From C5 itself we have dorsal scapular nerve. Also we have long thoracic nerve which originates from C5, C6, C7. Okay, C5, C6, C7 gives off branches which join together to form something called as long thoracic nerve. What does long thoracic nerve supply? Long thoracic nerve supplies the serratus anterior muscle. Now next, moving on to the trunk. Only the upper trunk gives off branches. Upper trunk gives off two branches, which are they? Suprascapular nerve and subclavius nerve. Nerve to subclavius and suprascapular nerve are from the upper trunk of the brachial plexus. What does the upper trunk consist of? It is the combination of C5 and C6. So, if the question comes like what is the root value of suprascapular nerve, it should be C5, C6. What is the root value of nerve to subclavius? It's again C5 and C6. Okay. Now, the divisions do not give any branches. Cords even gives branches. Like the lateral cord only gives one branch, that is the lateral pectoral nerve. The medial cord gives the medial pectoral nerve, the medial cutaneous nerve of arm, and also medial cutaneous nerve of forearm. Okay, these are the branches of the cords. Now the posterior cord gives off again four branches. First one, superior subscapular nerve, thoracodorsal nerve, inferior subscapular nerve. And the major nerve that arises from the posterior cord is the axillary nerve. Okay, now the major nerves that you have to study when studying the brachial plexus is about the terminal nerves. What are the terminal nerves of brachial plexus? We have the musculocutaneous nerve, we have the median nerve, we have the radial nerve, and finally the ulnar nerve. Okay, so we have the musculocutaneous nerve, which is actually from the lateral cord. Then we have the median nerve, which is formed by the combination or by the joining of the lateral and the medial cord. Then we have the radial nerve, which is actually the termination of the posterior cord, and finally we have the ulnar nerve, which is formed by the joining of the lateral and medial cord. Lateral and medial cord joins together to form the ulnar and median nerve. Then we have the radial nerve, which is directly from the posterior cord, and the musculocutaneous nerve is directly via the terminal branch of the lateral cord. Okay, some important conditions related to the brachial plexus injury is the Erb's paralysis, otherwise called as policeman's tip hand. It is due to the injury to the upper trunk. Upper trunk means what? This portion. So upper trunk will, if any injury, maybe the hyperextension of the neck during the delivery or any injury to the upper trunk, that will lead to something called as policeman's tip hand. Okay, otherwise called as Erb's paralysis. Okay, because there is a Erb's point. Next one, lower trunk. Any injury to the lower trunk will lead to the paralysis of the ulnar nerve and also the median nerve, leading to something called as Klumpke's paralysis, that is otherwise called as the deformity is called as claw hand. Okay, there will be clawing of the hand. Next, finally, I have mentioned about the long thoracic nerve, which is actually from the roots itself. Okay, branch of the root. And if the long thoracic nerve is injured, what happens? Long thoracic nerve supplies what? Long thoracic nerve supplies the serratus anterior. Serratus anterior is Attached to what? It is attached to scapula. So winging of scapula will occur. Okay, winging of scapula will occur in case of long thoracic nerve injury. Okay, so that was about brachial plexus. These are the nerves and these are the spinal segments or root values. Okay, and yeah, already mentioned about axillary nerve. Axillary nerve supplies a deltoid muscle. Okay, that is a major thing. Other muscles are also there, but deltoid is a major one. So deltoid muscle is supplied via the axillary nerve, and any injury in the radial, sorry, in the surgical neck will lead to the axillary nerve injury, and that will lead to deltoid paralysis. Okay. Similarly, subclavius is supplied by the nerve to subclavius. Dorsal scapular nerve supplies the rhomboid muscles, okay, and levator scapulae muscles. Long thoracic, I've already mentioned, is via the serratus anterior. Suprascapular is via the subscapular, right? Supraspinatus and infraspinatus muscles. Pectoralis nerve, median and lateral pectoralis nerve, it is via, it supplies the pectoralis muscles. Subscapular nerve supplies the subscapularis anterior major muscle. Thoracodorsal is supplying the latissimus dorsi. Okay, that is again dealt when we will deal about the muscles. Okay, just mentioning over here to know about the, to get you, to make you familiar with the names. Okay, so radial nerve, again it is a major nerve supply to the extensor compartment. Okay, extensors, all the extensors of the arm and forearm is via the radial nerve. Okay, musculocutaneous, muscle and cutaneous. Which muscle? It is the flexor muscles of the arm, and also cutaneous, which part of the skin, the lateral surface of forearm, and flexor muscles of arm. Which are the flexors of arm? The regular knowledge you have, right? Biceps brachialis and coracobrachialis. It is via the musculocutaneous nerve. Then the median nerve. Median nerve supplies the flexors of forearm. Okay, remember, median nerve supplies the flexors of forearm. Musculocutaneous nerve supplies the flexors of arm. Okay, so median nerve supplies the flexors of forearm, and other than that, we have pronator quadratus and pronator teres, and little bit of digital flexors also, and which is the nerve supply of the anterior anterolateral surface of hand. It is via the skin. So it has a cutaneous branch also to the skin over the anterolateral surface of the hand. Then coming to the ulnar nerve supplies the flexors of the hand. Okay, it supplies the flexors of hand, majorly the flexor carpi ulnaris. Not only the hand, the fingers. Okay, flexor carpi ulnaris, the adductor pollicis muscle, and small digital muscle, because ulnar nerve is otherwise termed as the fine movement. Okay, ulnar nerve is responsible for the fine movement of the hand. Of the fine movement is via the ulnar nerve. So the fine muscles, that is the small digital muscles, adductor pollicis. The smaller muscles are via the ulnar nerve, and also it supplies the medial surface of the hand, the skin over the medial surface. Lateral is via the median nerve, but the medial surface, both posterior and anterior, is via the ulnar nerve. Okay, so any numbness in the medial surface of the hand is because of ulnar nerve injury or impaction or anything. Okay, next, going into the lumbar plexus. Okay, lumbar plexus, again the same thing you remember: the roots, the trunk, the divisions, and the nerves. Okay, we have T12 to L5 roots which are taking part in the formation of lumbar plexus. We have the sorry for that, yeah, we have T12 and L1 which joins together to form, to give out two branches, that is ilioinguinal and iliohypogastric nerve, and also this upper trunk gives off a branch which connects with the anterior division of L2 to form genitofemoral. Just remember the names, that is enough. Okay, iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, genitofemoral. Okay, then we have axillary obturator nerve and lumbosacral trunk, that is via the anterior division. So questions will not come the as that of brachial plexus. Brachial plexus had nerves originating from the trunk from the root, etc., right? But here there is nothing that much complicated. Just you remember the nerves, the name of the nerves, okay? Iliohypogastric, because it is a lumbar plexus, right? So ilium, the term ilio, wherever you hear, it is connected to the lumbar plexus, okay? Iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, then genitofemoral nerve, then the obturator nerve, axillary obturator and lumbosacral trunk is from the anterior division. That is one thing you remember, okay? It is from the anterior division. Now the posterior division of all the other roots, majorly the L2, L3 and L4, joins together to form majorly two nerves. Okay, major two nerves. One is lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, and the biggest one is the femoral nerve. Other than that, we have a iliopsoas and iliacus nerve also. Okay, majorly we have this lateral femoral cutaneous nerve and femoral nerve, and then we have the other two smaller branches to iliopsoas and iliacus. Okay, this femoral nerve again reaches the lower limb and supplies the anterior compartment of thigh and the knee and little portion of the calf also. Okay, so that was about lumbar plexus. Remember the iliohypogastric, that supplies what? Iliohypogastric, right? So from the name only you can understand it supplies the abdominal muscle. Okay, and also it supplies the skin over the inferior abdomen and buttocks also, not that important, but remember the abdominal muscles majorly it is supplied by these two nerves, iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal. Okay, then coming to genitofemoral nerve, genitofemoral, the term only you can understand, it gives off branches to the portions of genitalia and also anteromedial surface of thigh. Okay, anteromedial surface of thigh. Okay, then lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, again the term is very easy, lateral femoral cutaneous, skin over the lateral portion and also of the anterior and posterior surface of thigh. Okay, majorly the entire portion of thigh except for the medial side. Okay, except for the medial side, all the other portions of the thigh is supplied by the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. Okay, why the anteromedial surface is via the genitofemoral. All the rest of the portions of the thigh, the skin of the thigh is supplied by the femoral nerve. By the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. Next, coming to the major nerve, that is a femoral nerve that supplies the anterior compartment, all the muscles in the anterior compartment, which is sartorius, quadriceps group, the adductors of the thigh, which is the iliopsoas and the pectineus. Okay, everything is supplied by the femoral nerve. Then, obturator nerve, other major important portion or nerve originating from the lumbar plexus. But remember one difference here, obturator and femoral nerve has the same root value, but femoral nerve is via the posterior division, obturator is via the anterior division. That is the difference. Okay, obturator nerve is from the anterior division of L2, L3, L4 but femoral nerve is via the posterior division of L2, L3 and L4. Now what does it supply? Obturator supplies the adductors. Okay, adductors of the thigh. Which ones? Rector magnus, brevis and longus. Then coming to the medial compartment of thigh, that is the gracilis. Everything that is there in the medial compartment of thigh is supplied via the obturator nerve. Okay. Next one about the sacral plexus. Again, sacral plexus is important. Remember where is it situated? It's situated in the posterior wall of the pelvis, right? How does it exit the posterior wall of pelvis? It leaves the pelvis via the greater sciatic foramen. Remember the greater sciatic foramen which we spoke about when we studied the bones, right? The hip bones. So greater sciatic foramen is the foramen from where this sacral plexus leave the pelvis, and that these plexus that enters the gluteal region. Okay, and this is the major nerve supply of the gluteal muscles. Okay, gluteal muscles and also the pelvis, gluteal muscles and pelvis. So all the anterior divisions of L4, L5, S1, S2 and S3 gives off these, all the anterior roots of the primary divisions gives off the branches to form the sacral plexus. Okay, just as how we had a division of we have a lumbosacral trunk, right? Lumbosacral trunk, which is actually a portion of anterior division of L4, which goes and joins to the sacral plexus. Similarly, that is this one. Similarly, it goes downwards and joins with the other roots, that is L5. Okay, it joins L5 root and also S1, S2, S3 root to form the tibial nerve. Okay, all the anterior roots together form the tibial nerve, and all the posterior roots together form the peroneal nerve. Okay, L4 to S3 together, the anterior roots join together to form the tibial nerve, and the L4, L5, S1 and S2 together form the peroneal nerve. And these two, peroneal nerve and tibial nerve, are actually not that separate with each other. That is why together they are called as sciatic nerve. Okay, together they are called as sciatic nerve. Sciatic nerve has two portions, common peroneal portion and the tibial portion. Common peroneal is from the posterior division and the tibial nerve is from the anterior division. Okay, there are other branches also which we will deal now. Okay, majorly we have sciatic nerve, which is L4 to S3. Okay, that gives off branches to the hip joint. It gives off branches to the knee flexors. It also gives off branches to the thigh muscles, that is the posterior portion of the thigh. It also gives off branches to the foot muscles. Fine. Then other branches of the sacral plexus are superior gluteal nerve. Superior gluteal, right? It gives off branches to the gluteal muscles. Now to quadratus femoris, and the term only is understood, right? It gives off branch to the quadratus femoris. Inferior gluteal. Inferior gluteal, remember one thing. Superior gluteal gives off branches to the gluteus medius and minimus. Inferior gluteal nerve gives branch to the gluteus maximus. Okay. Then we have obturator internus nerve. Okay. Nerve to obturator internus. Remember, obturator internus is supplied by the sacral plexus nerve. Okay. Not the obturator nerve. Fine. Then nerve to piriformis. Then posterior cutaneous nerve of thigh. Okay. Then perforating cutaneous, pudendal nerve, everything is via the sacral plexus. Okay, pudendal nerve. Then pelvic splanchnic nerve. Remember pelvic splanchnic nerve, when where we studied about that? We studied when we were talking about craniosacral outflow in case of parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, that is also given through the sacral plexus. Fine. And again, finally, we have nerve to levator ani and coccygeus, that is also via the sacral plexus. The major nerve is the sciatic nerve, and the questions can be asked regarding the inferior gluteal nerve and also the pudendal and pelvic splanchnic nerve. Okay, these gluteal nerves, sciatic nerve, and the pelvic splanchnic nerve and pudendal nerve, that you have to know. Other things, you if you don't know also, it is fine. Okay. Next, moving on to the cranial nerves. We'll do one thing, we'll take a 5 minutes break and then we'll rejoin. We'll continue with the portions. Okay. 5 minutes break. In this time, we just revise which and all is done, all the other things which we learned till now. Okay. Cranial nerves is a vast portion, that is why I'm taking a 5 minutes break and then we'll rejoin. Okay. I'm not ending the session, we'll pause it for 5 minutes. Okay. In the meantime, if you have any doubts till now, you can ask in the chat box. We'll wait for 2 more minutes and then we'll restart. We'll start with the cranial nerves. Yeah, we'll start with the cranial nerves now. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. What are they? Oculomotor, optic, olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducen, vestibulocochlear, facial, glossopharyngeal, hypoglossal, vagus, and axillary cranial nerve, right? So you all might have your own um, mnemonics for this. So use that and remember these cranial nerves. Okay, if you don't have necessary mnemonic, you just have to make your own mnemonics. Okay, every mnemonic is not comfortable for everyone. If you have mnemonics in your regional languages, well and good. Okay, that is more efficient. Okay, I might have a mnemonic for the cranial nerves in a Bengali language, so you might have a maybe a Hindi or a Tamil mnemonic for yourself. Okay, so make your own mnemonic and study. Okay, that will be more efficient for you. Fine. Yes, someone had asked about mnemonics also for me. So for cranial nerves here, there are English mnemonics also available. So if you have any kind of mnemonics which have been used from by your seniors or anyone, if you have studied from the first year onwards, that is well and good. Don't try to make new mnemonics by yourself. Okay, if you have that efficient what do you say skill to make mnemonics, as some of our friends do have, so if you have that capacity, then good. Otherwise we will be posting some of the other short forms of mnemonics, easy to remember things, in the group in the coming days. Okay, so English mnemonics are available, so if you're not comfortable with those, make your own mnemonics. Okay, so yeah, moving on to the first cranial nerve. Fine, I think most of you might be listening later on. Yeah, fine. So first cranial nerve, which is the first cranial nerve? We have our olfactory nerve. Okay, olfactory nerve is the first one. Olfactory nerve is responsible for what? It is responsible for olfaction, otherwise called as sense of smell, right? Sense of smell. Okay, this is the first and the shortest one. Okay, that is a major thing. It is first cranial nerve and the shortest. Okay, it is a shortest cranial nerve. Okay, and other thing, it is a special visceral afferent nerve. Okay, it is a special visceral afferent nerve. Okay, afferent nerve means what? It is a sensory nerve. It is a visceral sensory nerve. Afferent means usually responsible for senses. What sense? It is a sense of smell. It is responsible for transmitting smell. Okay. And embryologically, you can just a short thing about the embryological development. This olfactory nerve is from the olfactory placard. Okay, olfactory placard. Okay, it develops from the olfactory placard, and this gives rise to what? It gives rise to this olfactory placard is there. No, that also gives rise to glial cell. Glial cells are usually the supporting cells. Okay, it's the supporting cells. Fine. The olfactory nerve is actually a short nerve, short or the shortest nerve. Okay, it is the shortest nerve, and the anatomical course becomes important. Fine. It takes what? It takes a sense of smell from where? It takes a sense of smell from the olfactory epithelium. Okay, olfactory epithelium to the olfactory cortex. Cortex, that is a short course of the olfactory nerve. Fine. So the nasal epithelium is there, right? The nasal epithelium, it is located where? It is located in the nose. Okay, it is present in the nose, and this one, if you see over here, the roof of the nose. Okay, the roof of the nose, it is, we have our bundles of olfactory nerve. You can see over here this olfactory nerves. That is these bundles of nerves. Okay, these bundles of nerves are responsible for taking up the sense of smell. For it is a receptor. Okay, these are the receptors. Okay, it is a receptor, olfactory receptors. Now, one thing you need to remember about this olfactory nerves is the penetration via the cribriform plate. We have a cribriform plate, right? Cribriform plate in the, okay, in the frontal bone we have a cribriform plate. These olfactory nerve pierces the cribriform plate and reaches something called as olfactory bulb. Okay, it reaches the olfactory bulb. Now, the main thing about this olfactory receptors is the cells. Okay, olfactory receptors and the olfactory bulb, we need to remember about the cells that is responsible for this olfactory epithelium, the integrity and also the transmission of the impulses, right? In the olfactory bulb we have two kinds of cells. We have the mitral cells, we have the glomerulus, and similarly in the olfactory epithelium we have the glands of Bowman, we have the cells of support, we have olfactory cells and olfactory cilia. Olfactory cilia it lines a mucosa, that is nasal mucosa is lined by the olfactory cilia, which takes up the sense of smell, which takes up the smell. Okay, which takes up the smells. It transmits the smell into the glomerulus, and glomerulus, in the glomerulus there is synapse occurring. Okay, it is a synapse occurring with the mitral cell. Mitral cell projections enters a glomerulus, um, takes up the stimuli or the signal via the olfactory cilia, and it is transmitted to the olfactory cortex. That is how the olfactory impulse is transmitted into the olfactory tract. Okay, glomerulus is the majorly a synaptic glomerulus. Okay, it there is what occurs there? Synapse occurs. Okay, synapse occurs. Second order neuron, first order neuron is occurring from the olfactory cilia to the glomerulus. Second order neuron originates in the glomerulus to the olfactory cortex. Okay, that happens there. Now in the olfactory bulb we have a mitral cell which is responsible for the for taking up the impulses into the olfactory cortex. Now in the nasal epithelium we have support cells and also glands of Bowman. Okay, glands of Bowman is nothing but a mucosal secretory cell. Okay, it is a mucosal secretory cell. It secretes a mucosa. Fine. So these are the cells which are present in the nasal epithelium and also in the olfactory bulb. Olfactory bulb we have the glomerulus and the mitral cell, and in the epithelium we have a glands of Bowman, we have a supporting cell. Supporting cells are otherwise called as sustentacular cells. Okay, it is otherwise called as sustentacular cells. Sustentacular cells. These are support cells. That's it. Okay. So the glial cells. Olfactory cells are actually having projections at the cilia or microcilia, which take up the um, stimulus. Okay, which detect this odors or smells in the air. Okay, so that is how the olfactory stimulus is taken up and transmitted into the olfactory cortex. Okay, till here we studied olfactory cell. One more thing you remember is olfactory cell is actually bipolar neuron. It is a bipolar neuron. Okay, that is one thing you remember. See, one pole is connected to the dendrites, which takes up the or dendrites or cilia, which take up the odor or smell, take up the odor, and the other end is connected to the glomerulus where synapse occurs and the second order neuron starts. Okay, fine. So from there, next portion or next portion of the olfactory tract occurs. Till here we studied till the mitral cells. Mitral cells are also called as tufted cells. Okay, tufted cells. So from this olfactory bulb, second order neuron starts, and there one more synapse occurs in the anterior olfactory nucleus. Then what happens is that transfers into the cortex. That goes into the primary olfactory cortex. Okay, primary olfactory cortex and olfactory tubercle and other stuff. And here you need to remember other efferents also go into the amygdala. It also goes into the other portions, that is the thalamus, septal area and entorhinal area and orbitofrontal cortex. Okay, all these portions are also gets efferents from the olfactory bulb. Why the orbitofrontal cortex? Because once you get a smell, later on, if you see that object, you will remember that smell, right? You'll remember that smell. Every object, if you know, if for example, if you see if you see a fish, okay, if you see a fish, you will remember the smell of a fish, right? Or specific, yeah, for flowers, for rose, if you see rose, you will remember the smell of rose. So all those things are via this amygdala complex and also the orbitofrontal cortex. Okay, that is why efferents go into the amygdala and also the orbitofrontal cortex. And smell sensation and taste sensation are equally important, and it is associated together. That is the complex nature of this um, olfactory pathway. Okay, that is the complex nature of olfactory pathway. So yeah, with that, that is the olfactory pathway. Remember, the olfactory cilia, it is present in the nasal epithelium that takes up the odor. It is transmitted into the glomerulus where this olfactory cell synapses with the mitral cell, which takes up a second order neuron. Then it is transmitted into the primary olfactory cortex and other important structure in the cortex. Fine. That is about the first one, olfactory nerve. It is the first cranial nerve and the smallest cranial nerve. Okay, it is first and the smallest cranial nerve. Next one is the second one, optic nerve. Optic nerve is important because of its clinical significance. Okay, because of its clinical significance. It is a second cranial nerve, and what does it transmit? It transmits the vision. Okay, it transmits the vision, and where it is the embryologically it originates from the optic vesicle. Okay, it originates in the optic vesicle. Okay, optic vesicle. Fine. Now this one, remember, because it is formed in the optic vesicle, where is this optic vesicle present? It is present within the forebrain itself, right? It is actually a extension of forebrain. So this optic nerve, it is considered to be a part of central nervous system. Even though it is a cranial nerve, it is considered to be a part of central nervous system, and the other important feature of cranial nerve number 2 or optic nerve is that it is covered by the meninges. Okay, it is covered by the cranial meninges. It is surrounded by the cranial meninges. If that is one thing you need to remember. Okay, That is why in case of multiple sclerosis, which affects the central nervous system, it only affects only one cranial nerve, that is optic nerve. Okay, that is why optic neuritis occurs in case of multiple sclerosis. Fine. So yeah, about this anatomical course of this optic nerve, remember it transmits what? It transmits the vision. So any visual stimuli which um, falls over the lens, it goes and strikes retina, the retinal fibers. Retina takes up this visual impulse via the retinal ganglionic cells. Okay, we have retinal ganglionic cells. I'll just mention over here. Okay, retinal ganglionic cell. Okay, retinal ganglionic cell take up this impulses. Okay, and also it also receives these impulses via this photoreceptors. Okay, the receptors are actually the rods and cones, right? Rods and cones gives the visual impulses or the stimulus to these ganglionic cells, and this ganglionic cells, okay, these ganglionic cells converge together to form this optic nerve. Okay, this nerve is actually the convergence of this ganglionic cells. Ganglionic cells gets these impulses or the stimulus from the rods and cones. Rods and cones are what? They are the visual receptors of the photoreceptors of the eye. Okay, so yeah, so now this optic tract becomes important because of certain things I'll just mention over here. Okay, till this portion it is eye, right? It is outside the socket, it is inside the socket of eye, it is extracranial portion. Okay, extracranial portion. When the nerve leaves the orbit, okay, when it leaves the orbit, okay, it becomes an intercranial portion, it enters a cranial cavity. Okay, enters a cranial it enters a cranial cavity, and now is the major optic tract that occurs. Okay, optic tract. So remember, there is a right optic tract and left optic tract. See, this optic nerve that is formed by the convergence of these fibers, retinal ganglionic fibers, that comes to the optic chiasma. Okay, that has to cross over. We have a left fiber and right fiber in both the sides. Okay, both the sides we have right and left fibers. You can see over here. Sorry. Yeah, you can see over here we have a red and the blue fiber, right? Blue fiber takes up the medial side and the lateral side is by the red fibers. Okay, just for the sake of understanding, there's a difference in color. So the fibers from the left side or the lateral side are not crossing. Okay, remember the lateral fibers do not cross. Lateral fibers of retina or the optic nerve do not cross, and they just continue into the optic tract, okay, of the same side. But the medial side fibers, the blue fibers, see, only the blue fibers are crossing. Okay, blue fibers are crossing. So the blue fibers or the medial fibers of one side, for example the right side, goes to the left side, and the medial fibers of the left side goes to the right side. So now the optic tract, we have right optic tract and left optic tract. Left optic tract contains the lateral fibers of the left side. Okay, lateral fibers. So if this is the left side and there is a right side, so there is a left optic tract and this is a right optic tract. So left optic tract has the left or temporal, lateral, or this, say, visual field is divided into temporal side and nasal side. Okay, nasal or medial side, or lateral or temporal side, right? So the lateral fibers continue with the lateral tract itself, but the medial or nasal fibers cross in the optic chiasma. Okay, it crosses in the optic chiasma, thereby the left optic tract finally will contain the left temporal fibers and the right nasal fibers. Okay, I I hope you understand here. If you do not, I will just post this image. You can go over this again. Then only you will understand it. If you're not thorough with it, okay. The temporal fibers of the left side of left eye and the nasal fibers, okay, temporal fibers of the left eye and nasal fibers of the right eye will join together to form the left optic tract. Okay. Okay. Now, after the optic chiasma, the optic nerves are now called as optic tract. Now, this optic tract okay, will go and reach the lateral geniculate body. Okay, lateral geniculate body or lateral geniculate nucleus, which is present where? Which is present in the thalamus. Okay, this lateral geniculate body is present in the thalamus, right? So, this optic tract will go and synapse in the lateral geniculate body. See, it is going and synapting. It is it is forming a synapse over here. Now, the next order neuron will originate from the lateral geniculate body into the cortex, visual cortex. Visual cortex is present where? Visual cortex is present in the visual cortex is present in the occipital lobe. Okay, visual cortex is present in the occipital lobe. Fine. So, yeah. So, optic nerve is from the retina till the optic chiasma. In the optic chiasma, the nasal fibers or medial fibers decussate or it crosses over to the other side. Then after the optic chiasma, whatever is there, that is called as optic tract. Now, optic tract will reach the lateral geniculate body, form a synapse, and from the synapse, the next order neuron is now called as optic radiation. These fibers is there, no, that is called as optic radiation. Okay, that is called as optic radiation. That will reach the visual cortex or occipital lobe, and finally we will have the complete optic pathway. Fine. So there are certain terms called as Mayer's loop. Just remember the names, okay? Mayer's loop and everything is there. Not that important, but yeah, Mayer's loop, something called as Mayer's loop is there. That is present in the optic nerve, okay? Mayer's, Meyer, Mayer's loop. That is associated with the optic tract, okay? Basically optic radiation. Fine. So that was about second cranial nerve or optic nerve. So remember how I spoke about the visual field, how the visual field is happening in a partial form, how the temporal fibers take the images from the one side and the nasal fibers take the vision from the left side. Okay, similarly you can see in this figure, easily mentioned over here, okay, easily understood in this one. See, the visual field is occurring like this. Okay, visual field of the right eye, right visual field, and left visual field is divided. Okay, it is divided. So any image will have two visual field, left visual field and right visual field. So the light stimulus from the right side will reach to the nasal fibers of the right eye and the temporal fibers of the left eye. Okay, see, temporal fibers of the left eye and nasal fibers of the right eye. The pink, whatever you see here, that is actually the right visual field, right visual field. So remember this one, that is again complex in nature. That is why you need to understand the optic tract in detail to understand the visual laws. You might have heard about the visual laws, how there are different terminologies. Okay, hemianopia, quadranopia, all this terminology. If you need to understand that, you have to know in detail about the visual field and the optic tract. Okay, how the vision loss occurs. Okay, bilateral hemianopia, unilateral anopia, okay, complete vision loss, okay, scotoma, everything. If you need to know about that, you need to know about the optic tract. So remember the blue field, okay, blue is the left side. So left visual field and right visual field is it is shown over here. Remember the visual field of right side, that is a um, that is a pink one. This is the right visual field of the eye. Okay, right visual field is taken up by the nasal fibers of the right eye and the temporal fibers of the left eye. Okay, see the temporal fibers do not cross, right? It does not cross. So the temporal fibers would not cross and goes in the lateral portion of optic chiasma to the same side. Okay, but the right side, the right eye will not have a, it will have a crossing, it will cross. Okay, the medial fibers cross, right? It will cross from the right side to the left side, right? Understood, right? So the right side of the brain will take up the visual impulses of the left visual field, and left side of the brain will take up the visual field of the right side. Understood? So right visual field is processed in the left visual cortex. If you see the figure with the image, with the color, you can differentiate. The right visual field is processed in the left visual cortex, and the right visual field is processed in the left side. Okay, right side to the, mainly the crossing occurs. Visual field itself crosses. So if while doing an examination, you can see the person is not able to see anything in the right side, that means the left side is affected, left occipital lobe is affected. Okay, that is why in this one, in the figure 3, in the third point, you can see the left side is not there. Okay, left side, the person is not able to visualize anything in the left side. Okay, both the eyes, the left visual field is affected. That means in the in this figure, the left side, right, anything after this optic chiasma, okay, the injury is after the optic chiasma. It might be here, it might be here, it might be anywhere. Okay, the total damage has occurred in the optic tract. The injury is in the optic tract over here. That is why the same side of the visual field is affected. Okay, after the optic chiasma, any injury, if it occurs, the problem occurs in the same visual field. But there is one, the first one, if the first image, you can see the right visual field of right eye and left visual field of left eye is affected, right? Only the medial portion is seen. That means what? That means only the crossing fibers have been affected. What are the crossing fibers? Crossing fibers are the ones, okay, crossing fibers are affected. Only the crossing fibers are affected. That means this one, if you can see over here, the nasal fibers of the left eye and the temporal fibers of the right eye has been affected. Okay, that is according to this one. Temporal side of the right eye and the nasal fibers of the left eye has been affected. That is why, because you can see the because of the presence of our lens is convex lens, right? Convex lens always inverts the image. If you can see, the convex lens inverts the image. That is why the left visual field, the left side of the field, will go and join or fall in the right side of the eye, that is the nasal side. Okay, similarly the vice versa in the other side. Okay, so here you can see the temporal side of one eye and the nasal side of the other eye is affected. That means what? That means yeah, that means it has affected the optic chiasma. The optic chiasma itself is affected. So any problem in the optic chiasma is present where? It is present just above the pituitary gland, just below the pituitary gland it is present. Okay, so any pituitary adenoma or any injury to the pituitary gland or any hydrocephalus, okay, any hydrocephalus also, it finally goes and affects the optic chiasma, leading to this visual field loss. Okay, this is called as bitemporal hemianopia. See, the temporal field of both the sides are affected, right? I made a mistake, I guess. Yeah, this is the temporal field. The temporal field is affected. Both sides temporal field is affected. Okay. So temporal field, if it is affected, that means the nasal fibers of one side and temporal fibers of other side is affected. Fine. So that is what is called as bitemporal hemianopia. Fine. So that occurs in case of pituitary adenoma, etc. Okay, mainly pituitary adenoma or any condition of hydrocephalus that is occurring due to a problem in the pituitary pouch. Okay, I hope it is clear. If it is not clear, just text us in the group or text us personally. We will be explaining in detail about this thing. Okay. So this was about vision loss and types of vision loss. We have bitemporal hemianopia, right? Anopia means complete loss. Hemianopia means one side or one half of the vision is lost. Bitemporal we have, binasal is not common, it does not occur. Then we have hemianopia, that is homonymous hemianopia. Homonymous hemianopia that occurs in the optic tract. If the injury is in the optic tract, okay, that is called as homonymous hemianopia. These are two major questions which have been asked and which is usually prone to be asked in your PG life, or even you can see patients also presenting with these condition. If you have a patient with bitemporal hemianopia, immediately send the patient for further investigations or further treatment, because the patient is likely to have a pituitary adenoma, okay, tumor, brain tumor. Okay, so that was about the optic nerve. Next one is oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve is our third cranial nerve. Okay, third cranial nerve that you have to know. It's very much important because it supplies a major thing. Which is a major thing about the oculomotor nerve? You might have heard about SO4-LR6A3, right? SO4-LR6A3. What is it? It is a mnemonic for the extraocular muscle nerve supply, right? It is a cranial nerve. 3, that is oculomotor nerve. It supplies both motor and parasympathetic nerve supply, innervation. Remember when we spoke about parasympathetic nervous system? How about the constriction of pupillae? That is controlled by which nerve? That is controlled by the oculomotor nerve. That is why it has two functions. That is a motor function. Motor function means what? It supplies a muscle. Which muscle? Extraocular muscle. Which extraocular muscles? That we will be dealing with now. Okay. And not only extraocular muscle, it also supplies some other portions that I will be telling it now. Okay, fine. Motor supply is to the extraocular muscles. So to know that, you need to remember about the extraocular muscles. Which are the extraocular muscles? We have our superior oblique, inferior oblique, superior rectus, medial rectus, then lateral rectus and inferior rectus, and also levator palpebris superioris. This is also considered to be a extraocular muscle. Okay, majorly these are the extraocular muscles. SO4, LR6 and A3. SO4 means superior oblique is supplied by fourth cranial nerve. LR6 means lateral rectus. Lateral rectus is supplied by the sixth cranial nerve. Okay, and all the other, that is inferior oblique, superior rectus, medial rectus and inferior rectus is via the third cranial nerve. All the other, A3 means all the other three are via the third cranial nerve, that is oculomotor nerve, that is levator palpebris superioris. Then we have our superior oblique, inferior oblique, superior rectus, medial rectus and inferior rectus is supplied by the third cranial nerve, that is our oculomotor nerve. Fine. Levator palpebris superioris, superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus and inferior oblique is via the motor branches of the oculomotor nerve. Fine. Now coming to the course of this oculomotor nerve, where is it located? It is located in, it is means a nucleus. All the cranial nerves are from the nucleus, right? The oculomotor nerve is also from the nucleus, which is located in the midbrain. Okay, it is located in the midbrain. There is a this the whole portion, this figure is completely the midbrain. So this completely the midbrain. So in here we have a nucleus. This nucleus is the oculomotor nucleus. Okay, this one gives rise to the oculomotor nerve. It gives rise to the oculomotor nerve. Fine. It goes into the cavernous sinus and then it goes outside in extracranial route, that is it enters a cavernous sinus, it gives off certain branches, it also gives off sympathetic branches. Okay, I've not mentioned it earlier, but yeah, it gives off sympathetic branches also, but majorly parasympathetic branch, but it also gives little amount of sympathetic branches to the choroid plexus, not choroid, carotid plexus. Okay, gives off sympathetic branches to the carotid plexus. Then what happens is that it leaves the cranial cavity. It has an extracranial root and it has an intracranial root. Just as how the optic nerve had an extracranial and intracranial root, similarly, this also has a intracranial and extracranial root. In the intracranial root, it goes within the lateral aspect of cavernous sinus. Okay, lateral aspect of cavernous sinus is enters the and then it enters the supraorbital fissure. It enters the supraorbital fissure and leaves the supraorbital fissure. After it leaves the supraorbital fissure, it gives off two branches. Okay, it gives off two branches, which is a superior branch and the inferior branch. Okay, superior branch gives off supply or motor supply to the superior rectus, superior oblique and levator palpebrae superioris. Not superior oblique, sorry. Superior rectus and levator palpebrae superioris. Two motor branches are given. Okay, to the superior rectus and levator palpebrae superioris. Similarly, the posterior branch, or not posterior, inferior branch gives off motor branch to inferior rectus and inferior oblique. Okay, two branches to inferior rectus and inferior oblique. Now, it also gives off parasympathetic preganglionic fibers. Okay, preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. Remember about the constriction of pupil, that is via the ciliary ganglion. See, we have a presynaptic or preganglionic parasympathetic fibers innervating the ciliary ganglion, which gives off supply to the ciliary muscles. Okay, which gives off ciliary muscle supply, which is responsible for the constriction of pupil. Okay, which is responsible for constriction of pupil. So remember all those things. It gives off supply to the nerve supply to the superior rectus, levator palpebrae superioris, inferior oblique and inferior rectus. Okay, and it also gives off preganglionic parasympathetic fibers to the ciliary ganglion, that later on does what? It later on goes and is responsible for the constriction of pupil via the parasympathetic stimulation. Okay, now one more nerve supply is there to the medial rectus, which is not shown over here. Okay, that is also via the posterior route. Okay, it is via the posterior or inferior branch. Okay, inferior branch gives off inferior rectus supply, inferior oblique supply, and also medial rectus supply. Okay, so that was about this one. And yeah, one more thing, it gives off ciliary muscles supply, right? Ciliary muscles and also sphincter papillae supply. Okay, the constriction is via the sphincter papillae. Okay, not papillae, pupillae. Sphincter pupillae and ciliary muscles are also supplied via the ciliary ganglion. Fine. So that was about oculomotor nerve. Okay, next moving on to trochlear nerve. Okay, trochlear nerve is important because there are certain exceptions when we speak about cranial nerves. Trochlear nerves have little exceptions, or it is also called as features. Okay, important features that you have to know about trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve is the Shortest. Okay, it is not shortest, it is the smallest cranial nerve. Okay, it is the smallest cranial nerve, but it has the longest intracranial course. Okay, most of the cranial nerves has an extra and intracranial course, right? But the trochlear nerve has the longest cranial nerve, but is the smallest one. Okay, smallest or thinnest, you can say. Okay, because the number of axons of trochlear nerve are lesser. Okay, it is a fourth one. It is a paired cranial nerve, and this one is the smallest cranial nerve by the number of axons. But even though it is small, it has the longest intracranial course. Okay, it has the longest intracranial course. See the third point over here. The most slender, and it has the longest intracranial course. Other thing you have to remember is about the origin. Okay, that we will deal now. So you can see over here, this is the trochlear nerve. You can see it is coming from where? It is coming from the pons. Okay, it is coming from the not pons. It is coming from the midbrain. Okay, just above the pons, right? So this one, trochlear nerve, emerges from the midbrain. Okay, midbrain posteriorly. Okay, posteriorly. It is the only cranial nerve that exits dorsally or posteriorly. See, it is coming like this. It's coming from the posterior aspect of the midbrain. You can see in the next images. Yeah, this is abducens nerve. See, abducens nerve is also emerging from the midbrain, but it is coming from anterior portion. It is coming anteriorly. But this this one, which is the trochlear nerve, it exits dorsally or posteriorly. It is the only cranial nerve which exits dorsally. Okay, that is what you need to remember. And it also supplies the opposite side. So it crosses the opposite side. See, before emerging only, it will cross. The optic nerve was crossing in the optic chiasma, that is after the emergence. Even the olfactory nerve, that is not crossing, that is crossing later on. But before emerging only, this trochlear nerve will cross within the midbrain from left to right or right to left. Okay, and it exits dorsally. That is one more thing you have to remember. Next important thing you need to remember is about the course is that this also enters the not enters, it moves along the lateral wall of cavernous sinus. Okay, the oculomotor nerve, the abducens nerve, the ophthalmic and majorly the ophthalmic and maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve, all those nerves, these travel along the lateral wall of cavernous sinus. Okay, then it enters the superior orbital fissure. Okay, just as we had our oculomotor nerve which entered the supraorbital fissure, similarly the trochlear nerve also enters the orbit via the superior orbital fissure. And what is the function of this trochlear nerve? It only has one function, that is innervating one muscle. Which muscle is that? It innervates. Remember SO4 LR6A3? This is the SO4, that is superior oblique. Superior oblique muscle is innervated by the trochlear nerve. Okay, SO4, it is via the trochlear nerve. Okay, it innervates a contralateral side superior oblique nerve. Fine. Okay, it innervates a contralateral superior oblique nerve. It exits the midbrain dorsally. It has the longest intracranial nerve, even though it is the thinnest one. Then other thing, it shows complete internal decussation, internal crossing from one side to the other. That was about trochlear nerve. Now coming to the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal is our fifth cranial nerve, right? Fifth cranial nerve. It is called as trigeminal because it has three origin. Okay, it not only has three origin, it also has three divisions also. Okay, it has three origin and three divisions, three sensory origin. Okay, to specifically say, it has three sensory origin. In this image, if you can see this image, see, we have the trigeminal nerve is responsible for sensory nerves, sensory supply, motor supply, and also parasympathetic supply. Okay, The trigeminal nerve, it supplies, it gives off sensory branches, motor branches, and also parasympathetic branches. And if you talk about embryology, it is derived from the first pharyngeal arch. Okay, this from the first pharyngeal arch. It has sensory supply, motor supply, and even parasympathetic supply. Okay, now you need to remember about the course. Okay, it has three sensory nuclei. If you can see over here, this orange one, blue, and green. These are sensory nucleus. Trigeminal nerve has three sensory nucleus. First is mesencephalic, that is the midbrain. Okay, mesencephalic. Yeah, it is given over here. It is a mesencephalic nucleus. It has a main sensory nucleus or principal sensory nucleus and also a spinal sensory nucleus. Okay, it has a mesencephalic nucleus, spinal sensory nucleus, and also a principal or chief or main sensory nucleus. That is the sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve, and it also has a motor nucleus. Thus, it has a separate motor nucleus. Okay, all these nucleus are from the midbrain to the spinal cord. Okay, it has entire extension from the midbrain to the medulla and also a little bit to the spinal cord. Okay, so at the level of this pons, you can see these roots that is arising from the mesencephalic, chief, and or principal, and the spinal nucleus, right? At the level of pons, these three join together. Okay, these three join together. Okay, these three join together, and then it goes into the middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa after reaching the trigeminal ganglion. Okay, there is something called as trigeminal ganglion that is present in the middle cranial fossa. There what happens is that after this it is entering into trigeminal ganglion, it gives off three branches. Okay, it gives off three major branches, that is the ophthalmic branch, maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. Okay, this middle cranial fossa, the trigeminal ganglion, it is present in the middle cranial fossa. This trigeminal ganglion is also called as Gasserian ganglion. This other name for trigeminal ganglion is Gasserian ganglion. After this formed, we have three branches, that is ophthalmic branch, maxillary branch, and mandibular branch. Okay. Now what happens is that the ophthalmic branch goes and innervates the major structures in the ophthalmic division. Okay, ophthalmic division, otherwise called as V1. It gives off nasociliary nerve, frontal nerve, lacrimal nerve. Okay, and maxillary nerve is a V2 branch that gives off the branches of the maxillary portion of the face. That is zygomatic nerve, infraorbital nerve, and the teeth, superior or alveolar nerves. Maxillary nerve also gives off meningeal branches. Okay. Then coming to the mandibular nerve. Now remember the motor nerve, right? Motor root, motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve also gives off a motor division that goes along with the mandibular nerve. Okay, that goes along with the mandibular nerve. And now the motor nerve gives off branches to the, what are these? Temporalis, lateral pterygoid, masseter, medial pterygoid. These are the muscles of mastication, right? The muscles of mastication are supplied by the trigeminal nerve. Other than that, we have other palatal muscles, tensor palatini and tensor tympani. Okay, tensor tympani and tensor palatine are also supplied by via the motor branches of trigeminal nerve. Okay. Now mandibular nerve I have spoken, right? Mandibular nerve also gives off branches. Mandibular division also gives off branches to the tongue. Lingual nerve. Okay, lingual nerve is also, it also gives off branches. It is from the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Okay. So these branches, you just, if you don't remember the major nerves, no worries, it's okay. Just remember about the tensor tympani, tensor palatine, the muscles of mastication, and also remember about the mylohyoid. Okay, that is the other branch that is the motor branches. If you don't remember the sensory branches, it is fine. If you have to remember the motor branches. Okay. So the divisions V1, V2, V3, that is the ophthalmic branch, maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch, and the motor nucleus, which gives out the motor nerve of motor branch of the trigeminal nerve, that goes along with the mandibular nerve and gives branches to the muscles of mastication, tensor tympani, and tensor palatine branch. Okay. And one parasympathetic supply I have mentioned, right? This parasympathetic supply is to the lacrimal gland. Okay. The lacrimal gland, see the zygomatic nerve is there, right? The zygomatic nerve and the lacrimal nerve. Okay, these two nerves join together to give off parasympathetic supply to the lacrimal gland. That is one extra thing that is not mentioned over here. Okay, the zygomatic branch and the lacrimal branch. Zygomatic branch is a branch of the V2, that is a maxillary branch, right? And the lacrimal branch is a branch of our V1, that is ophthalmic branch. This lacrimal nerve and zygomatic nerve gives off preganglionic parasympathetic innervation. Okay, preganglionic parasympathetic innervation. Okay, to the lacrimal gland. Why? Because why it is not the, when I mentioned about the parasympathetic nerve, I have not mentioned about trigeminal nerve, right? That is because the major lacrimal gland supply is via the postganglionic fibers of pterygopalatine ganglion. Okay, pterygopalatine ganglion, that is the portion of facial nerve that I will mention now. The facial nerve was giving the major parasympathetic supply, but this also, the lacrimal nerve and the zygomatic nerve also takes part in this lacrimal gland innervation. Just remember that. That is enough. If you don't remember this, it's okay. If you remember, just remember about facial nerve. That's enough. Okay. Major thing you have to remember. The takeaway thing about the trigeminal nerve is the major nerve nucleus. That is three sensory nucleus and one motor nucleus, and the three divisions: the mandibular, maxillary, and the ophthalmic branch. Okay, and also the muscles of mastications, that is supplied by the trigeminal nerve. Next, coming on to the abducent nerve. Abducent nerve is our sixth cranial nerve, and the only thing you have to remember about this abducent nerve is the nucleus. Where it is present? It is present in the it is present in the pons. Okay, it is present in the pons. Abducent nucleus, it is present in the pons, and it is it exits the brainstem, because it exits the brainstem with the pontomedullary junction. That is enough. Okay, about nucleus, if you remember that, that is enough. But if you have to know more, there is something called as Dorello's canal. Okay, Dorello canal or Dorello's canal. Okay, Dorello's canal, that is actually the area through which this abducent nerve enters. Okay, that or yeah, the course of in the course of abducent nerve, this after exiting the pontomedullary junction, this abducent nerve, just an extra information. Okay, that is what I'm telling now. This Dorello's canal is the root of this abducent nerve after it crosses or after it exits the pontomedullary junction. Okay, that is present in the subarachnoid space. Okay, so this also enters the cavernous sinus. I mentioned before, right? It also enters the cavernous sinus. It also exits the superior orbital fissure, and the only function of this one is motor innervation to the lateral rectus. Okay, lateral rectus, LR6, lateral rectus muscle. Lateral rectus innervation is the only function. only function of this specific nerve. Okay, abducer nerve. It is a sixth cranial nerve, purely somatic nerve, and it the nucleus is present in the pons. The exit of this nerve is from the pontomedullary junction. It goes into the Dorellos canal, exits the Dorellos canal, enters the cavernous sinus, that is the lateral portion, then exits a cranium via the superior orbital fissure, and it supplies, or it ends by supplying the lateral rectus muscle. Okay, if you remember that, is enough. Okay, that was about abducer nerve. Next, coming into the facial nerve, most important nerve of the cranial nerve. Okay, so cranial nerve is the seventh cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. Remember, this is associated with the second pharyngeal arch. Okay, second arch. First arch was trigeminal nerve. Second arch is facial nerve, right? So the facial nerve has 4 functions, 4 major functions. First one, motor. It gives off nerve supply to the muscles of facial expression, facial muscles, and also certain neck muscles like the digastric muscle, then stylohyoid and stapedius muscle in the ear, right? Then we have sensory supply. Sensory supply of what? Sensory supply to the ear. Okay, sensory means cutaneous. Okay, not the special sensory. Sensory supply to the ear, external concha, or external concha of the ear. Then special sensory. Special sensory is the taste. Okay, taste to the anterior two-third of tongue. Special sensory supply to the anterior two-third of tongue via what? Via the chorda tympani. Okay, via the chorda tympani. Special sensory to the anterior two-third of the tongue, taste sensation, and that is via the chorda tympani branch. Then it also gives off parasympathetic branches. Remember parasympathetic branches to what? It supplies the lacrimal glands. I mentioned in the when I was talking about them and about the trigeminal nerve, right? So similarly, it gives off supply to the lacrimal glands. Not only lacrimal glands, it also gives nerve supply, parasympathetic nerve supply to the nasal, palatine, and pharyngeal mucosal glands, and also salivary glands. Which salivary glands? Submandibular and sublingual glands. Okay, submandibular and sublingual glands. Okay, I'll mention in the course of this one. It also has a extracranial course and an intracranial course. Okay, inside the cranium and outside the cranium. Inside the cranium, it arises where? It arises in the pons. Okay, you see, this is the pons, right? This is the pons. So it arises inside the pons. This is the nucleus of the 7th cranial nerve. It crosses above the, or it twists above the abducer nerve and crosses the abducer nerve, right? So there are 2 routes. Okay, there are 2 routes. It also has a motor route and also has a sensory route. Just as trigeminal nerve, it had 3 sensory nucleus and 1 motor nucleus, right? Similarly, this one, this facial nerve has 2 routes. Okay, it has a sensory route and also a motor route. Okay, that is what you need to know. It has a sensory route and also has a motor route. Fine. So these 2 routes crosses or enters the, see these 2. If you see over here, these are sensory route and this is a motor route. Okay, this enters the internal auditory meatus or internal acoustic meatus. Okay, internal acoustic meatus. Then it enters a facial canal. There's something called as facial canal. Just as we had Dorellos canal in the abducer nerve, we have facial canal in the facial nerve. Okay, now after it enters there, what happens is that there's a ganglion formation. See, this ganglion formation occurs. There's a ganglion formation after it enters the facial canal. Okay, then what happens is that In the ganglion, before reaching the ganglion, this sensory root and the motor root join together, okay, and form the ganglion. And from this ganglion or geniculate ganglion, we have a branch that is going into the sphenopalatine ganglion and then supplying the lacrimal gland, that is a parasympathetic supply. Okay, then it also gives off blood supply to the chorda tympani branch. See the chorda tympani branch that is supplying the submaxillary, sublingual, and also the anterior two-third of the tongue. And again, it gives off branches to the stapedius in the in the middle ear. Okay, stapedius is present in the middle ear, right? So within the facial canal, it also gives off. It is not shown over here. Yeah, it also gives off nerve supply to the stapedius muscle, that is nerve to stapedius. It also gives off the greater petrosal nerve, okay, greater petrosal nerve, and chorda tympani. Chorda tympani reaches or innervates the maxillary, sublingual, and the anterior two-third of tongue. Okay, then sphenopalatine ganglion supplies a lacrimal gland, and when we have nerve to stapedius and greater petrosal nerve, the last two nerves that is arising from the facial nerve. Okay, then finally it exits the facial nerve, exits the facial canal via the stylomastoid foramen. That is not written or shown over here. I'll just mention just here and write it down. Okay, it enters the facial canal. It exits the facial canal and through the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, through the stylomastoid foramen. After that only it gives off the motor roots. Okay, all these things are other ones. Okay, it gives off the special sensory and the parasympathetic. That is everything in parasympathetic and special sensory is within the intracranial root only. Now after it exits this one stylomastoid foramen, it gives off the other branches. Okay, which are the other branches? It terminates into 5 main branches. Just how we had 3 branches of trigeminal nerve, similarly we have 5 last branches of the this one facial nerve. First one is I'll mention over here. I've forgotten to mention over in the slide. So first one will be the temporal branch. Okay, temporal branch. Then we have zygomatic branch, temporal zygomatic buccal, then mandibular or marginal mandibular branch, and finally cervical branch. Okay, these are the branches or the terminal branches of our facial nerve. Okay, see all these muscles, all the muscles that originate from the second pharyngeal arch. Okay, that is a stapedius muscle, that is stapedius. Then we have our occipitofrontalis, we have our digastric muscles, we have our muscles of facial expression, we have our stylohyoid muscle. All the muscles which originate from the second pharyngeal arch are supplied by the facial nerve, because facial nerve is originating from the second pharyngeal arch. So all the muscles originating from the second pharyngeal arch also has to be supplied by the facial nerve, right? Remember that. Okay, the first motor branch of this facial nerve is only within the facial canal, that is a nerve to stapedius. Then we have our posterior auricular nerve. Then we have our digastric muscle, the posterior belly of digastric, that is also supplied by the facial nerve. Then we have our frontalis, the facial muscles, the frontalis, orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, then buccinator, then zygomaticus, then depressor labii inferioris, depressor anguli oris, platysma. See, the cervical branch gives off one nerve supply to the platysma. Okay, then others, the temporal gives off frontalis, or orbicularis oculi, and corrugator superciliary muscle. Okay, these are by the temporalis. Zygomaticus, zygomatic branch gives off nerve supply or innervates the orbicularis oculi. Remember, don't confuse between zygomaticus and zygomatic branch. Zygomaticus is supplied by the buccal branch, and zygomatic nerve supplies the orbicularis oculi. Okay, there's a slight difference. I'll just share an image into the group later if possible, showing the muscle supply of motor supply of the facial nerve. Okay. Now, special sensory function, I've already mentioned it is via the chorda tympani branch of the facial nerve. It innervates the anterior two-third. Okay, it innervates the anterior two-third of the tongue. Okay. So that was about facial nerve. Next, moving on to the cranial nerve number 9, okay, which I have mentioned over here. Cranial number 9 I have mentioned. We have not mentioned cranial number 8, that is our vestibulocochlear, that will be dealt in a short over here. Later, when we study about the ear, when the head and neck is done, that time in detail it will be dealt with. Okay. So, the glossopharyngeal nerve, that is the 9th cranial nerve, it has motor function, sensory, and parasympathetic function. Then the sensory function is for the oropharynx, carotid body, sinus, with sinus, carotid sinus, then the posterior one-third of the tongue. Okay, the posterior one-third of the tongue is innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, the special sensory function is via the to the posterior one-third of the tongue. So remember the ganglions, how we had pterygopalatine ganglion over here. All the cranial nerves has its own ganglion. Okay, we have our trigeminal ganglion and trigeminal nerve. We had our sphenopalatine ganglion in case of the sphenopalatine ganglion or and the geniculate ganglion in case of facial nerve. Similarly, the otic ganglion, there is something called as otic ganglion, which is present with respect to the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, that is the only thing you remember over here. Extra things, glossopharyngeal nerve is not as important as that of facial nerve root. So just remember the posterior one-third of tongue is supplied via the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the nerve supplied to the stylopharyngeus, then tonsils, then the lingual nerve, the carotid body or the carotid sinus, everything is via the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay. See, till now whatever we have mentioned, okay, whatever we have mentioned, I have just put it into the boxes over here. Olfactory nerve, it is the sensory, it takes an innervation on the sensory nasal mucosa. Optic nerve, it is via the retina. Oculomotor nerve gives off motor supply and the sensory supply, or the special sensory supply. It's not special sensory, parasympathetic supply. So motor supply is to all the olfactory, not olfactory, all the extraocular muscles except for the superior oblique and lateral rectus, and then it also gives off supply to the ciliary muscles and also to the sphincter pupillae. Then yes, one thing I forgotten to mention about the nucleus of olfactory nerve. Olfactory nerve has two nucleus. Okay, Edinger-Westphal nucleus and nerve of oculomotor nerve. Okay, the sensory or the parasympathetic supply is via the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Okay, Edinger-Westphal nucleus is the axillary nucleus. The main nucleus is the oculomotor nuclei itself. Then the trochlear nerve, nothing much to remember. Just remember it is the thinnest one with the Um, this is the thinnest one with the largest extra or the longest extracranial intracranial root. Then also remember that it exits in the posterior portion of the midbrain, and also it innervates the superior oblique muscle. Then trigeminal nerve, already mentioned everything. It supplies the muscles of mastication. Also digastric muscle, that is anterior belly. Posterior belly is via the facial nerve. Then tensor tympani muscles. Okay, and also it has three branches, that is ophthalmic nerve, maxillary nerve, and mandibular nerve. And nucleus, it has three sensory nucleus and one motor nucleus. Okay, abducens nerve, nothing much to remember, just remember the motor supply to lateral rectus muscle. Facial nerve, it is very important, exits the stylomastoid foramen. We have lots of nucleus over here. We have superior salivatory nucleus, motor nucleus, and nucleus of solitary tract, and spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. All these together form the facial nerve. Okay, I have not gone in detail about facial nerve nucleuses, but remember these nucleus. Okay, these are the names of nucleus. We have a superior salivatory nucleus, motor nucleus, nuclei of solitary tract, and spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve, which gives off branches to the facial nerve. Then it has sensory supply, it has motor supply, it has parasympathetic supply also. Okay, special sensory, motor, and parasympathetic supply. Fine. Then coming to vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve is special. It is for special sensory sensation of what? Sensation of hearing. Okay, sensation of hearing, and also um, the field of innervation is to the spiral organ. Okay, organ of corti or macula of cuticle. All these things you'll learn when we talk about ear. Okay, then remember vestibulocochlear nerve, it is composed of two nucleus. Okay, two nucleus, that is vestibular nucleus and cochlear nucleus. Cochlear nucleus, again there are two, dorsal and ventral nuclei, and the main kind of nerve, it is special somatic afferent nerve. Okay, special somatic afferent. Afferent means what? Sensation. Special somatic afferent, sensations of hearing. Then finally glossopharyngeal, it is the ninth cranial nerve. It is having parasympathetic supply, it is having motor supply. Okay, it's having motor supply and parasympathetic supply. Okay, this has major nucleuses, that is nucleus ambiguous, inferior salivatory nucleus. Remember, superior salivatory nucleus was of facial nerve, inferior salivatory nucleus is of glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, then again nuclei of solitary tract. Nucleus solitary tract gives nerve roots to facial nerve and also glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, that is why the lower cranial nerve nucleuses are somewhat fused. Okay, you can say it as fused, but yeah. Then also spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. See, spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve is a long structure, right? It is a long structure and it gives off roots to trigeminal nerve, gives off roots to facial nerve, it gives off roots to glossopharyngeal nerve also. Okay. So yeah. Then vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is a major parasympathetic nerve that you have to know. It supplies most of the organs of the body. Okay, all of the vital organs. It supplies the lungs. It supplies the lungs in the case. It gives all the parasympathetic fibers to the lungs or the bronchus. Gives off parasympathetic fibers to the heart, to the GI tract, hepatobiliary tract, everything. Okay. It has motor branches and sensory branches. Okay, and also parasympathetic branches. Nucleus is the dorsal motor nucleus, nucleus of solitary tract, and the special spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve, and nucleus ambiguous. Okay, nucleus ambiguous is common to the 9, 10, 11 and 12. Okay, 9, 10 and 11, not the 12, 9, 10 and 12. 9, 10 and 11, because it is common to these three. See, nucleus ambiguous is with the glossopharyngeal, with the vagus, and finally with the spinal axillary nerve, right? We cannot differentiate which fibers are going into vagus, which fibers are going into glossopharyngeal, or which fibers are going into spinal axis. That is why it is called ambiguous. Okay, So remember, vagus nerve gives off sensory supply to the carotid body, also to the meninges, then laryngeal muscles, pharyngeal muscles. We have a recurrent laryngeal nerve, then we have epiglottis, which is also supplied by the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is a major nerve because if vagus nerve is depressed, all the organs, all the abdominal or thoracic organs will go into malfunction. That is why it is important to know. Okay. Then coming into axillary nerve, it is also getting supply, or the nucleus is from the nucleus ambiguous and nucleus of axillary nerve. It is from the C1 to C5. That is why it is called as spinal axillary nerve, because it has origin both from the spinal cord, that is from the C1 to C5, and also from the um, brainstem, from the nucleus ambiguous. What does it do? It supplies. It has motor supply to what? To the laryngeal muscles, the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. Okay, sternocleidomastoid, trapezius, and laryngeal muscles are supplied by the axillary nerve. Okay. Yeah, and main function of this axillary nerve is the innervation of laryngeal muscles, sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. So sternocleidomastoid and trapezius are responsible for what? Movement of head and the shoulder. Okay, thereby that is done. Next one, the last cranial nerve that you have to know is about the hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal nerve is majorly a motor nerve, and that supplies the tongue. The muscles of the tongue, intrinsic muscles of the tongue, is supplied by the hypoglossal nerve, and also certain extrinsic muscles of tongue, except for palatoglossus. There is one called as palatoglossus. Except for that one, all the other muscles of tongue, extrinsic and intrinsic, is via the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, the movement of tongue is controlled by the hypoglossal nerve. Fine. So with that we finish the cranial nerves, and with that we finish the portions of neuroanatomy. So a little recap: the smallest cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve, the largest cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve, shortest cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. Okay, shortest means the course is the shortest. Olfactory nerve is the shortest cranial nerve. Trochlear nerve has the smallest, means the thinnest cranial nerve with the longest intracranial course. Okay, the longest intracranial course. Remember the one more thing about crossing over, the artery that crosses the optic nerve is the ophthalmic artery. Okay, and yeah, cranial nerve 3 and 4. Cranial nerve 3 and 4 has their nuclei in the midbrain. Okay, then we have 9, 10, 11 and 12 have their nuclei in the medulla, and all the other nerves are there, right? They have the nuclei in the pons. Okay, 3 and 4 in the midbrain, 9, 10, 11, 12 in the medulla. Okay, so with that, I think most of the cranial nerves have been finished. Vestibulocochlear nerve, vagus, and spinal axillary will be mentioning later on again. That is why we have not dealt in detail over here. So with that, we finish this portions of neuroanatomy. We'll meet in the next class, most probably day after tomorrow. So in case there is any difference in the sessions, we'll let you know. If any doubts, you can ask now. I know it has been a tedious session today, so if any doubts, you can ask now, or else we'll wind up for today. Okay, thank you for listening. So these nerves are important, but yeah, the somatic nerves means the brachial plexus and the lumbar plexus and sacral plexus. Again we will be dealing again when we learn about upper limb and lower limb. So that is why we have not stressed upon the nerve supply. Only the roots have been explained again. So we'll be dealing with those things again when we learn about the muscles. Okay, so when we learn about the muscles, we will learn about the attachments also, and also about the nerve supply. So yeah, that was it. Cranial nerves, the specific ganglion you have to remember. You have to remember the roots or the nucleus where it is originating, and extra specific important things like the smallest one, the largest one, the thickest one, the thinnest one. Such things are important. And also the neurons, how there are bipolar neurons in the vestibulocochlear and the olfactory epithelium. Such things you have to remember. Okay. So yeah, with that we finish today's class. Thank you for listening.